One. Good evening. I am Chancey Hayward, and I will be covering my case study on the faulty ignition switches of General Motors. My case involves 30 million recalled cars worldwide due to faulty ignition switches, which could shut off the engine during driving and thereby prevent the airbags from inflating. Mary Barra, who's the CEO of General Motors, had to testify on Capitol Hill about this situation. During her testimony, she had recapped some of the actions that General Motors had already taken in this case. Some of those issues that she raised was one, reluctance to raise issues or problems by General Motors. She had specific quotes that she gave during the testimony. One was, some witnesses said that they were reluctant to raise issues or concerns in the GM culture. A lot of what was raised during this situation was that it was a culture of negligence from General Motors. Second thing she said was what they call the GM salute. One witness described the GM phenomenon of avoiding responsibility as a GM salute, a crossing of arms and pointing towards others, indicating that the responsibility belongs to someone else, not me. Next issue she raised was the GM nod. Mary Barra, who's the CEO, described the phenomenon known as the GM nod, where everyone nods agreement to a proposed plan of action, but then leave the room with no intention to follow through, and the nod is an empty gesture. As I was researching this issue, some of the things that I found was that this issue has been going on for over 10 years and had never risen to the level of senior leadership that it should have, which is why it went on for so long. So in her testimony, she talked about a proliferation of committees, she being Mary Barra's current CEO. The issue passed through an astonishing number of committees. We repeatedly heard from witnesses that flagged the issue, proposed a solution, and the solution died in committee or with some other ad hoc group exploring the issue. But determining the identity of an actual decision maker was impenetrable. No single person owned any decision. Indeed, it was often difficult to determine who sat on the committees or what was considered, or there were rarely minutes of meetings. Now, I found that hard to believe, being that we're talking about GM, one of the largest U.S. manufacturers of vehicles in the world, and they didn't keep minutes of their meetings. The next thing she raised was conflicting messages from top management. Two clear messages were consistently emphasized from the top. When safety is at issue, cost is irrelevant. And number two, cost is everything. One engineer said that the emphasis on cost control at GM permeates the fabric of the whole culture. And last but not least, she spoke of no sense of urgency. One engineer wrote, "This issue has been around since man first lumbered out of the sea and stood on 2 feet. The processes seem designed to only accelerate corrective action when safety or cost was a driving factor." So in this case study, we're talking about GM recalling 30 million cars worldwide due to faulty ignition switches. The current status of GM currently is, surprisingly, GM is currently the #1 U.S. auto manufacturer, rising above Tesla and Ford in the past 2 weeks. That's according to the New York Times. So what has been done? GM has paid over $600 million in compensation for 124 deaths and forfeited $900 million to the United States. This is according to BBC. The recall cost more than $3 billion in shareholders' value over 4 weeks. That's according to CNN. Some of the statements the CEO also made about what has been done is we named Jeff Bauer Vice President of Safety for the company, elevating and integrating our safety process under a single leader. Jeff reports directly to Mark Roos, and they both have a meeting regularly. These are all mitigations that they're using to help prevent this from happening in the future. She said that they added 35 safety investigators that will allow them to identify and address issues much more quickly, and they've already seen positive results from this work. Third, they've instituted a Speak Up for Safety program encouraging employees to report potential safety issues quickly, and we're going to recognize them for doing so. So employees will get incentives for speaking up when they see something potentially hazardous as it concerns safety. Number 4, she said that they announced the creation of and have now implemented a new global product integrity organization that will enhance their overall safety and quality performance. And finally, this is an incredibly important one according to Ms. Mary Barra, the CEO. They've restructured the safety decision-making process to raise it to the highest levels of the company. Senior management is now going to be at the center of these issues. So those are the 5 things that they've done outside of over $1 billion that they've paid out in compensation and forfeiture to the U.S., to the United States. So the question, was it effective? Well, that's relative to who you ask. If you ask the families of those affected by the tragic deaths, it was not effective because they believe it's a cultural issue. According to affected families, the families of 13 people who died in car crashes involving the recalled vehicles gathered outside the U.S. Capitol on April 1st prior to the CEO's testimony. At the Capitol, they also said that their relatives had died because they were a cost of doing business GM style, which speaks about the culture. On April 8th, the National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration fined GM $28,000 because the company hadn't supplied the agency with the information it had requested it give them by April 3rd. And the agency charged them $7,000 for each day after then that GM didn't provide this information. So GM didn't provide the information until after May 16th, when they agreed to pay the Department of Transportation the maximum fine of $35 million for delaying the recall of the defective cars they recalled earlier in 2014. So to answer the question, was it effective? I say no. Because outside of 15 employees being fired, settling with families affected by this recall and paying a fine, how does that really change the culture of the employees who are still employed by GM, who are detached from the higher echelon issues going on with the company? So what could be done differently? The U.S. can enforce tougher rules regarding the disclosure of automobile defects, like involuntary manslaughter or even voluntary, since they knew years ago that this was a serious safety concern. There is no excuse that a company of GM size and status should have been able to get away with this for over 10 years. That's not just a matter of the GM culture, but also a matter of weak enforcement on the side of those that are expected to regulate this type of behavior and enforce tougher rules. That concludes my case study. Thank you.